Derek Martin walked into a police station in Brighton, south of London, and said 4 words that shook a community. "I've murdered 2 people." His victims, prosecutors say, were none other than his stepdaughter, Khloe Bashford, and her husband, Josh. After a long, delayed journey through the courts, Martin is finally on trial. But what purportedly drove him to commit such a violent act? Does he have a defense? We're going to break it all down with an international attorney. Welcome to Sidebar. I'm Oibek. When Derek Martin walked into Brighton police station one evening back in June of 2023, police say he told them the unimaginable, 4 words that would change everything. "I've murdered 2 people." And those 2 people were his former stepdaughter, Khloe Bashford, and her husband, Josh. Now, if you haven't heard about this case, this one takes us overseas. It takes us to East Sussex, England, a tragedy that touches on family ties, hidden resentment, mental health struggles, and a justice system that, even now in 2025, still hasn't delivered closure. So today, we're going to unpack how a quiet family dispute spiraled into absolute tragedy, and how it left an entire community stuck waiting for closure. This takes us back to June 9th, 2023, on a Friday afternoon in Newhaven, which is a coastal town near Brighton. Khloe Bashford was at home. She was a 30-year-old mother of 4. Her husband Josh was working that day. Friends and family described them as amazing parents, saying they were funny, loving, the kind of couple who seemed to hold their world together effortlessly. But behind the scenes, there was tension. Now, to be clear, it wasn't between Khloe and Josh. It was between Khloe and someone she still called Dad, Derek Martin. According to the Times UK, Derek had once been married to Khloe's mother, Elaine. He'd helped raise Khloe from her early teens, and even after the divorce, she stayed in touch. They texted often, they saw each other, and she reportedly treated him with the same affection she always had. But in the months before that June day, something changed. Martin was sinking, especially financially. He had taken to gambling. According to the Times, the debts apparently piled up. The BBC reports he was around $11,000 in debt. And 6 months before the killings, he reportedly stopped taking antidepressants. Per the Telegraph, he told police he felt used all the time, and as if he could never do enough for people. And so on June 9th, Martin arrived sometime that morning at Khloe and Josh's home on LSC Road in Newhaven. This is according to authorities.
But what happened by midday, prosecutors say, unfolded in a matter of minutes. At around 12:15 p.m., prosecutors allege that Martin and Khloe spoke briefly in the kitchen, possibly about money. Police later confirmed there were no defensive wounds consistent with a long fight. Instead, the attack, according to them, began suddenly and violently. Investigators believe the initial weapon that Martin used was a hammer. Prosecutors in court this week said the first blow struck the top of Khloe's head. Moments later, Martin allegedly grabbed a large kitchen knife and stabbed Khloe 8 times. Prosecutors say that 2 of those wounds went in 20 centimeters deep, about 7 inches, killing her. At approximately 12:20 p.m., Khloe's husband Josh came home. Prosecutors believe he was confronted almost immediately by Martin, who was still holding that knife. Josh reportedly ran upstairs into his bedroom where he suffered multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma to his face and neck. Prosecutors say Martin then allegedly strangled him, possibly using a belt that was found at the scene. After the killings, the BBC reports that prosecutors say Martin started to move through the house methodically, changing his clothes, removing door handles from the bedrooms where police later found the couple's bodies, and detaching the doorbell camera from the front of the house. He then apparently left the property. And where did he go? To pick up his grandchildren from school that afternoon. Investigators say he collected Khloe and Josh's children from school, brought them to a Costa Coffee in Peacehaven and a McDonald's, then drove them to their grandmother's home, his ex-wife, Elaine Sturgis, before leaving them safely in her care. Prosecutors also say he told the oldest child that their parents had a big row, meaning a disagreement. A short while later, he would be accused of sending Elaine an absolutely bone-chilling message. And we'll get to that part of the story in a minute. But first, to help break this all down, international law attorney David Tiefert joins us again. Let's start here. In cases involving premeditation versus sudden acts of violence, how does UK law determine the severity of the charge? How do UK investigators handle a crime like this?
Well, it's not altogether different from how we do it here in the US. They're going to look at all the evidence they're able to collect. And in this case, it's helpful that the defendant gave a confession the same day he allegedly committed these murders and provided some explanation for why he did it. There's also other evidence based on people he spoke to right before the alleged crimes. They'll take all of that into account. And of course, the most interesting part to me is his defense now of insanity.
Yeah, I want to get to that. But you talk about the evidence they've built in this case so far, the removal of security cameras, the disposal of the phone in the building. When you're talking about a case of premeditation or obstruction of justice, that feels quite significant. I mean, your opinion about the evidence against him, putting aside the idea of mental health, that would suggest a level of planning or premeditation, right?
Yeah, certainly with respect to the cameras and some of the other things he did before the crimes, that would show premeditation. Disposing of his stepdaughter's phone, which I understand happened after the crime, would not show premeditation. Moreover, there was some evidence at least one grandson said he had a really bad temper, which would suggest that might be one of the explanations for why this happened that didn't involve premeditation. So I think it's going to be a bit of a tough case to make on the evidence, but it's certainly possible.
Let's explore this. What role does mental health play in UK criminal cases for violent crimes? If he claims that he was temporarily out of his mind due to depression or not taking medication, does that affect guilt? Does it affect sentencing? What should we be thinking about?
So the UK has what's called the M'Naghten Rule, which is from the mid-1800s, and they followed it ever since. It says that if a person is suffering from a serious mental condition, and that condition caused them to not know what they were doing, or not know that what they were doing was wrong, then they could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. In that case, this sentencing would be potentially very different. The UK also has a concept that's a little bit different, which is diminished capacity as a result of a mental issue. That can be used to lessen the charge, but not to have the defendant found not guilty by reason of insanity.
We'll get into more aspects of this case. Do you think the insanity defense applies here from what you've seen? Well, apparently he does have a history of depression. He was on medication for that depression, and he went off the medication about 6 months before the alleged crimes. Those are facts he would likely use. It's going to depend on what the experts say. I believe he has to have 2 psychological or psychiatric experts give their opinions on whether he was insane at the time the crimes happened, and that will be an important part of the case. There's obviously, both here in the US and in the UK, a lot of controversy around defenses like this, and so the court has to be mindful of that, especially because this case has received so much media attention. Let me tell you what might complicate that. Sometime after dropping the children off at Elaine's, Martin is believed to have sent this message to her. According to the BBC, quote, "Ela, I'm so sorry. I can't believe what I've done. I know everyone hates me anyway, especially the boys. I hate myself anyway, and please, please look after the children really well." He then reportedly unlocked Khloe's phone, read messages from her daughter, and replied to the girl using his own phone saying, "Mom said not today." David, what do you take away from that? How does that affect, after everything we just talked about, mental health, a possible insanity defense? I think that could be problematic. I absolutely agree with you. I read that message he sent to his ex-wife a number of times. It's a bit awkward and a bit odd, but it doesn't show someone who seems to be insane. It doesn't show someone who doesn't understand what they did or that it was wrong. In fact, he's apologizing for it on the same day it happened. That's going to be potentially devastating evidence for his claim that he was insane on that day. And this would be admissible as far as you know? I think so. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be. She's going to be able to testify to it, and they have the message evidence that will be submitted. And in this kind of case, it's not going to be considered hearsay. For those who might say,
I don't know, those messages are ambiguous. Was it really a confession? Here's the other problem. Not long after allegedly sending those messages, he apparently walked into Brighton police station and confessed, purportedly flat out telling them, "I've murdered 2 people." Martin was arrested at the station without incident and kept under observation overnight. During interviews, according to the Times, he told detectives he had flipped, that he hadn't planned to kill them, but just lost it. And on June 10th, 2023, Martin was formally charged with 2 counts of murder.
Now, David, we know that in cases here in the States, whenever someone is accused of confessing, the first thing defense attorneys look at is, was it coerced? Were they read their rights? What were the circumstances? What exactly was said? Is that the same thing we're talking about in the UK? Or are we saying right now, this looks like a pretty straightforward confession that's going to be really tough for the defense? Those could be issues in the UK, but even under US standards, the facts suggest this wasn't coerced. He voluntarily turned himself in, told his ex-wife he was going to do so, and went in with a confession ready to give. It wasn't an involuntary interrogation that led to the confession. So for those reasons, it'll be hard for his defense lawyers to get that thrown out or excluded. Now, this idea that if he's admitting this, then why don't we take everything he said if it wasn't planned? It wasn't necessarily premeditated, right? His mind may have been centered around money, and maybe he and Khloe got into some kind of argument before he allegedly killed her. From what you know, could that argument be considered provocation? Could that in any way reduce a murder charge in the UK, a heat-of-the-moment kind of thing? Yeah, the heat-of-the-moment argument could remove premeditation if the court believes he was acting suddenly as a result of his temper and in the moment. However, that defense is going to be much harder to make for the second person he killed, because after he killed his stepdaughter, he laid in wait for her husband and attacked him when he walked in the door.
And that sounds much more like premeditation, and I'm not sure how he's going to avoid a finding of premeditation given those facts.
Yeah. And we also know, according to the Times UK, that Martin had lent Khloe around $800 in American money, which she had been gradually repaying. The BBC reported that Martin himself was facing nearly $11,000 in debt, largely stemming from gambling. At the time of Khloe's death, she had reportedly reduced her debt to about $200. But according to the Daily Mail, Martin had lent Khloe and Josh various amounts of money over the years, $1,000 for a car, $600 for bills, and $1,500 for family expenses. And you wonder how that might factor into the case. Could it factor in? Could a defense lawyer, David, argue that this financial dispute played a role in some way?
I mean, when I read out those numbers, it could be part of the larger story. I think it's certainly part of the motive that the prosecution will try to establish, and it certainly doesn't make him look good. Obviously, you can't resort to violence to collect any debt, but this is a very small debt, the type of loaning of money that happens among family members all the time. So for him to be enraged by the fact that she owed him a pretty small amount of money, $200, and for that to be an excuse or a basis for him to attack and kill her, that's pretty outrageous. And I mentioned earlier that Martin had reportedly stopped taking antidepressants months before the tragedy. ITV reports that in multiple interviews with psychiatrists, Martin was believed to have suffered from a depressive disorder, although the outlets reported that their opinions vary on whether it was truly severe enough to excuse him from culpability. And David, I think you mentioned this before. This is going to come down to what, a battle of the experts.
I think so. It'll be a battle of the experts. If he has really good experts who have a lot of experience diagnosing people with serious mental impairment, and they're able to establish that based on their discussions with him and his medical records, then that could give him a stronger basis to make that insanity defense. So Martin is currently on trial in Brighton. The proceedings started on October 6th. It was not an easy road getting there, by the way. Martin actually first appeared in court in August of 2023, according to the BBC, where, despite reportedly confessing to the killings, he instead chose to plead not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter. The court remanded him into custody ahead of a trial initially scheduled for November 2023. Since then, the trial has been postponed 5 times.
Ministry of Justice figures reviewed by the BBC reveal that there are currently 75,000 Crown Court cases waiting to be heard. The backlog has grown so severe that some new cases aren't expected to be scheduled until 2029. David, how common is that in the UK? I'm not sure that it actually sounds a bit like our system where we have an enormous backlog. We don't have enough judges, we don't have enough prosecutors. I don't know if this is new for the UK system or a result of budget cuts to their justice system, but I will say the family members have complained about it, saying that repeated postponements have caused them a lot of distress. You'd hope it reaches a quick resolution now and there will be no further delays. And the idea that you had a defendant here who pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter even after confessing, was that strange to you? No, I think that has to do with the defense available in the UK for diminished mental capacity, and that's what he's basically going for. He realizes he's unlikely to be fully successful with a complete insanity defense, but he's trying to get that diminished capacity verdict, which would lower the charge. Well, his trial is expected to last 3 weeks. Anything you're going to be on the lookout for? Just what happens with the experts likely to testify about his mental condition and how the case proceeds regarding premeditation, especially the distinction between the first alleged murder and the second. The second will be more interesting on the premeditation side since he was laying in wait for the husband.
David DeFury, thanks so much for taking the time.
Appreciate it. Thank you.